Hi, folks, and welcome back to The Original Church. Did the original Christians believe in transubstantiation? First, we have to talk about what transubstantiation is. Now, this is a philosophical name for a concept that's actually pretty simple, and most rejection of it comes from a misunderstanding of it. Transubstantiation means that there is a change in substance. Transubstantiation, change in substance. But in order to understand what that means, you need to correctly understand what substance is. The substance of a thing is the underlying essence of that thing, what makes it what it is. And the church fathers understood that everything has two aspects to it. There is the essence of a thing, the underlying reality, and then there is the tangible elements, the elements or aspects of the thing that are accessible to the senses. But it's the underlying reality, it's the spiritual essence of a thing that really makes it what it is. And the point is that the underlying spiritual essence of anything is more real than the tangible aspects. It is more the core of the thing than those aspects of the thing that are accessible to the senses. So the substance of a thing is its spiritual underlying essence. And this is partly based on Plato, but it's also consistent with Hebrew wisdom. And this is how the church fathers and the early church understood the world. So, transubstantiation says that there is a change in the underlying essence of the Eucharistic elements. But it does not say that there is a change in the tangible aspects of the elements. The substance of the bread and the wine change into the substance of the body and blood of Christ. And this is a miracle. But the feel, the taste, the smell, the sound of pouring or whatever, these do not change. They remain the tangible aspects of bread and wine. That is the doctrine of transubstantiation. It is a miracle that takes place on the altar table at every Mass. But you are not meant to believe that the elements should look or taste different after the consecration. The real presence of the body and blood in the Eucharist, this is the spiritual presence, the higher presence, the deeper presence, the divine presence, not the tangible presence. That's a lower presence or a surface presence. That's not what we're talking about. When we talk about the real presence of the body and blood of Jesus Christ in the elements of the Eucharist, we are talking about that underlying essence. Okay, so that brings us to the question, did the original church believe this? Did the church fathers teach this? The answer is yes, they did, but they just didn't call it by the word transubstantiation. That word comes along later. But we can see this doctrine in all of the church fathers. And I can prove this because it's there in the beginning, and they use it to argue against the Docetics and the Gnostics. They use the doctrine of the real presence of the body and blood of Christ to argue against those fringe groups that said Jesus was a ghost or a phantom and didn't have any body and blood, right? And so we can see right from the very beginning the doctrine of the real presence. And by the way, I'm simplifying this for the sake of trying to make this video as short as possible. But if you want the full story, not only a complete description of the doctrine of transubstantiation, but the whole story of the trajectory of the development of the Word and the history of the controversy, check out my book, Handed Down, The Catholic Faith of the Early Christians, from Catholic Answers Press. It's called Handed Down. It's all in a chapter in that book. So yes, it is clear when you read the church fathers that they understood what a substance was. In fact, this is the same concept they used to talk about the Trinity. The Trinity is three persons in one substance. That is, the one essence of divinity. Because there's only one God, there can only be one substance of divinity. That is the very substance of God. It is the most real thing in the universe. And the substance of any created thing is also the most real part of that thing. And so it's clear from the church fathers that they understood the difference between the substance and the tangible aspects of a thing. The substance of the thing, well, they would say you can only see that with the eyes of faith. The tangible aspects are the material or the physical aspects, and they are what is accessible to the senses. But always remember, for the church fathers, the unseen and intangible is the spiritual, which is more real than the physical or the material. And it is more important than the aspects of a thing that you can see or feel. This is what all the church fathers taught and what all the original Christians believed. And it wasn't even questioned at all until the 9th century. And even then, the question that came up was really more of a question of, which is more real, the spiritual or the material. They all sort of understood that the body and blood of Christ were present in a spiritual sense. They just argued over whether the spiritual was more real or the material was more real because you could touch it. And some people wanted to go so far as to say that, whatever you can touch is the part that's more real. And they had this dualism that matter matters more than spirit. And in fact, in the Enlightenment sort of doubles down on this dualism. But the church has always rejected this dualism in the early church and in the Middle Ages and now. But it was this question of which is more real that led to the controversy over the Eucharist, and that controversy led to the clarification of the doctrine, and that clarification led to coining the term. It led to the word transubstantiation. So, why didn't the original church call it that? Why didn't they use the word transubstantiation? Well, because the word transubstantiation comes from the debate in the Middle Ages. It comes out of medieval scholasticism. It comes from trying to use Aristotle to explain Plato. Now, the medieval scholastics, they had the same two categories as the church fathers. That first category is the substance of a thing, the underlying essence. The other category, the material or physical aspects of something that are accessible to the senses, well, that category, the medieval scholastics called the accidents of something, sort of like saying the add-ons, the things that are accidental to or in addition to what really makes the thing what it is. So in this debate in the Middle Ages, the point was to reiterate the original teaching. The substance of a thing is what is more real than the physical or material aspects, and to clarify that one can change without the other changing. And so the substance can change without the accidents changing. Now, I go into all of this in more detail in a chapter in my book, Handed Down: The Catholic Faith of the Early Christians, from Catholic Answers Press. So if you want more detail on the doctrine of transubstantiation and the medieval debate and all of that nuance, that's all in that chapter in my book, Handed Down. But this is the doctrine of transubstantiation in a nutshell. The substance of bread and wine change into the substance of the body and blood of Christ. The accidents do not change. The aspects that are accessible to the senses do not change. So any idea that you are literally chewing the flesh of Christ is a gross misunderstanding of the doctrine in both senses of the word gross. It's a crude literalism based on what is called annihilationism. In other words, every bit of the bread and wine are annihilated, and all that's left is, the actual physical flesh of Jesus Christ. We don't believe that. That is a misunderstanding of the doctrine. And so any rejection of transubstantiation is usually actually a rejection of the misunderstanding of it. People who reject transubstantiation, even Catholics who say they don't believe it, they're usually rejecting something else, like this annihilationism, this gross literalism. And by the way, the other extreme, the idea that the Eucharist is only a symbol or only a memorial, this is called memorialism. No one ever believed that before the Protestant Reformation. No one in the original church ever taught or believed that. Okay, so this is transubstantiation. But if you're not comfortable with that term, it's okay to just say that you believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. The real presence means the more real spiritual presence of the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. And keep in mind that the word transubstantiation is a Western term that comes from medieval European scholasticism. The Eastern Christians don't use it. They have their own ways to talk about what the church has always taught that are not based on Western medieval philosophy. But we're basically saying the same thing because we are all saying what the original church said. Now, here's an important point. There are two things that you cannot do at this point. First, you cannot compare Eastern and Western teachings on the Eucharist, and then when you don't see the word transubstantiation in the East, claim that they would disagree with it or reject the doctrine. The Easterners are saying the same things we are, just using different words. And if anyone disagrees with me on that, I would love to have this conversation, not a debate, but a friendly conversation with someone from the Orthodox communions, and we can talk about the nuances in how we understand the Eucharist. I would love to have that conversation. Contact me. But for now, it's enough to say that East and West, we believe the same things about the Eucharist because we believe what the original church believed and taught. The other thing you can't do is go back to the church fathers and look for the word transubstantiation, and then when you don't find it there, say that the church fathers didn't teach it or didn't believe it. You can't do that. That's not how patristics works. You have to know how to read the church fathers to see what they say in context, to see what they say even though they're not using the later terms for it, and to know what their consensus is. The word transubstantiation is a Western word and a medieval word, but it does faithfully explain what the original Christians all believed and what the church fathers taught. And we can see from our Eastern brothers and sisters that it's not the only way to describe the Eucharist or to teach the doctrine of real presence, but it is a legitimate way to describe what the church has always believed. Okay, now this is a super important point. The doctrine of transubstantiation is not a development in the church. It's very important to understand this. The word took time to develop. The clarification of the doctrine took time to be more fully explained. But the doctrine is not something that comes later. The doctrine of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, which we now call transubstantiation, was there from the beginning. It's there in the teachings of Jesus in John chapter 6. And if you don't want to see it there, look at the earliest church fathers and what they taught and how they taught the real presence and how they believed they were correctly interpreting John chapter 6. So this is actually a different case from things like a celibate clergy or the veneration of icons. We've been talking about some of these developments in other videos. A celibate clergy developed because at the very beginning there was a limitation of only one marriage for clergy, and then that developed into no marriages by the end of the 4th century. Still early, but it is a development. The veneration of icons developed from the very early original veneration of relics, which then gets expanded to the veneration of icons. But again, that development still takes place pretty early, but it took a little bit longer to clarify the technical terms around the boundaries of the use of icons, okay? So yeah, those are developments in the early church. But this question, the doctrine of transubstantiation, is not a development at all. Yes, the word transubstantiation took a while to come in as the clarification of the doctrine developed. But the original church did teach the real presence, and then later they invented a word that they used to describe it. But this is not a development. This doctrine was there from the beginning. Just like the original church did teach the sinlessness and perpetual virginity of Mary, but later had to come up with the phrase Immaculate Conception to talk about it. And if you're interested in that, see my video on the Immaculate Conception for more on that. But that's kind of what's going on here. And even more so is that the case here with the Eucharist, because the doctrine of the real presence is there from the very beginning, and then the explanation of the doctrine sort of becomes fleshed out over time. But listen, no theology of the Eucharist ever existed in the original church except this one. No theology of the Eucharist ever preceded the doctrine of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, which we now call transubstantiation. It was there from the beginning. Okay, so now since you've stuck with me this far, I'm going to give you a helpful analogy for thinking about the doctrine of transubstantiation. Imagine a Christmas present. It comes in a box with wrapping paper and a bow. Inside the box, there is a gift, and it sits under the tree. Well, that present has two parts to it: the gift inside the box and the packaging. And this is I think, helpful way to think of substance and accidents. The substance is like the gift inside the box. The accidents are like the packaging. So imagine if you had a Christmas present waiting for you under the tree that had a certain packaging, but maybe not such a great gift inside, maybe a kind of everyday thing. And someone came along and swapped out the gift inside the package for something much more valuable, but left the packaging the same. And that's kind of what's going on in the Eucharist. The packaging of the bread and wine remain the same, but the essence of the gift has been swapped out for something much more valuable. So maybe that will help you think of it, and if you ever have to explain it to any of your friends or family, think about the Christmas present. I hope that helps. So, did the original church teach the doctrine of transubstantiation? The answer is yes. Yes, they did. They just didn't call it that yet. In the Middle Ages, the scholastics used Aristotelian categories to come up with a word that describes what the church had always believed and taught. They did teach and believe in the real presence of the body and blood of Christ in the elements of the Eucharist. The church had always believed this, that the sacrament is a miracle. It just took the church 1,000 years to come up with a fancy word for it. Well, that's the way it was in the original church. I hope you'll join me again for the next video. Thanks for watching. Hey, thanks for watching. Well, you know the drill. Subscribe, notifications, blah, blah, blah. But if you liked this video, please share it. And if you want more, consider getting one or more of my books. Or better yet, join me and the original church community on locals.com. There you can comment and interact with the rest of us. I hope to see you there.